Let's go ahead and get it started with the team that made possibly the biggest trade in the offseason. Of course, I am talking about the Minnesota Timberwolves. Now, the biggest change they made by far is adding center Rudy Gobert. He's a three-time Defensive Player of the Year. They traded a huge package for him. Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverly, Walker Kessler, who they just drafted, Jared Vanderbilt, Leonardo Balmero, and 4 future first-round picks. Definitely a huge trade for the Minnesota Timberwolves, but they also signed Kyle Anderson, longtime veteran in the NBA, Bryn Forbes as well, so 2 former Spurs. They also got Eric Pascal, former Golden State Warrior, and Austin Rivers. So the top key for the Minnesota Timberwolves for me is, what does Gobert's arrival mean? And, we talk a lot about Rudy Gobert, and, a lot of people say a lot of different things. Some guys, you ask what Rudy Gobert will bring to a team, they'll let you know that he's one of the best defensive players in the league, and he can automatically flip your defense from a bottom 5 to a top 5 defense like he did in the Utah Jazz many, many years. But also you got some people who will bring up the fact that he was never really able to live up to that contract that he got in Utah, that he didn't really deserve his money, because although he would be able to do really good things on defense, especially during the regular season, he'd also have moments on offense where he showed how limited he was. And, there's plenty of compilation videos where you can go and just see Rudy Gobert trying to do something in the post, and he either fumbles it or he's not necessarily the most skilled guy when it comes to offense, but he does have a lot of valuable skills. He does put up very great efficiency numbers, and he's routinely in the high 60s, even low 70s when it comes to field goal percentage, and he's one of the best finishers in the paint offensively as well. So it's a very mixed bag in terms of reactions you get to Rudy Gobert. But what is he going to bring to Minnesota? Now, when you bring in a guy like Rudy Gobert, as I said already, it's automatically going to make your defense better. I mean, you got guys who will drive into the paint, and once they see that 7'1" Frenchman, they will immediately pass it out, because they already know that Rudy will send it back. And that definitely does have an impact on the defense when you can just automatically, with your paint presence alone, force guys to play the perimeter on offense. Yeah, if they get hot from 3, of course, they're going to be able to defeat you. But, when you're just taking away one dimension offensively and forcing them to either play in the mid-range or the three-point game, it takes a lot out of the offense. And we saw that in Utah, where they didn't really have the best perimeter defensive players. In fact, you could argue 1 through 4, they really didn't do Gobert much favors when it came to adding defenders around him to prop him up. But it didn't really matter, because Utah would routinely have the number 1, number 2 defense, top 3 defense. I remember 2 years ago, 2021-22, where it was really a really great carry job by Rudy Gobert. He not only led Utah to one of the best defenses in the league, they were number 1 that season, but the difference between him being on the court and off the court was tremendously staggering. And, unfortunately, when it comes to the postseason, when they play the good teams, that's when they kind of expose a lot of the weaknesses that a Gobert-led team usually brings on defense. Now, Utah, I think one of their big issues was the fact that they didn't really get any other defensive-minded guards specifically around him. And when you don't have many people who can scare your offense at the point of attack, or really slow down guards at the point of attack, especially in such a guard-heavy league, you're going to get exposed on defense. No matter how good a Gobert is, no matter how good of a rim protector you have, you got to have guys who can at least slow down the other opposing guards. So many times when it came to the playoffs, you would see teams constantly just pick apart that defense and just really go right at Rudy Gobert, just simply because whenever they got to the top of the key, it was a turnstile. Donovan Mitchell hasn't really been the most consistent defender. Mike Conley, at his old age, he wasn't quite able to bring you the defensive performances he was able to do in Memphis. And guys like Joe Ingles and, they had Jonas Jerebko at a time, just guys like that weren't really able to give you that much on the defensive end. And they were putting a lot of pressure on Rudy Gobert's hands. And ultimately, that always ended up failing them in the long run in Utah, which is why they were never able to capitalize and win a championship there, despite the great seasons they had, and which is ultimately why they decided to tear it all up this offseason. So you have to question, I think the question is, how much does Rudy Gobert's defense really mean in the long run? Because I think that Minnesota are definitely going to be a playoff bound team, especially when you got a guy like Rudy Gobert in there who's going to prop up your defense. That's definitely something the Timberwolves have needed for a long time. Even before last year, before they were even in the playoff discussion, their defense would always be holding them back. So, now having both him and Karl Anthony Towns be the men down low, it takes a lot of pressure off of Karl Anthony Towns back, who is notoriously not a great defender. For as great as an offensive player he is, he hasn't been that great on defense. So having Gobert there definitely takes pressure off of his plate when it comes to defense. But are we going to see more of what we saw in Utah, where it's Rudy Gobert really coming through and saving them in the regular season and holding down the fort? And, just having a good defense can really just, even when you're having a bad shooting performance, having Rudy Gobert down there really helped the Jazz in the regular season. But, when it comes to the postseason, is Gobert going to have an impact on Minnesota? How much of an impact will he have? Will he be able to take them from just a playoff team to a title contending team? That's just something that I don't know quite yet. I don't know if Rudy Gobert can be the big difference maker. And I think when it comes to just difference makers in terms of being a playoff team and a title contender, the guy you look for in Minnesota to flip that switch is definitely an Anthony Edwards. And that's the next thing I want to get to when it comes to previewing the Timberwolves. How good is Anthony Edwards going to be, and can he take that third-year leap? Anthony Edwards, his rookie season was very, very up and down, but he did eventually turn it around and was able to put on a performance that almost got him the Rookie of the Year award. He ended up losing that to LaMelo Ball, but definitely in his sophomore season, I think he pulled ahead of LaMelo and asserted himself as the top of the class. Anthony Edwards, definitely a high-flying, athletic guard. And, I think that he's a guy that has a ton of potential. And as everyone says, he does have that dog in him. And he's a guy that is kind of really flipped how people perceive the Minnesota Timberwolves. Before Anthony Edwards came there, they were always perceived as a pretty good young team and a team that always had potential. But I think they would always really be disappointed at the end of the year. They only had one playoff appearance, and that was when Jimmy Butler was on the team. But you take the Jimmy Butler year off, and it's just been nothing but disappointment after disappointment. And until last year, when Anthony Edwards really made that sophomore leap, you didn't really have much hope for Minnesota, even with Karl Anthony Towns there. But Anthony Edwards came in last year, averaged 21 points, and he even upped his assist per game as well. And I think that he became a dynamic two-way player that the Minnesota Timberwolves definitely wanted him to be after drafting him number one. So how big is his third-year leap? Because I think that we've seen Karl Anthony Towns. He's definitely a solid player, but for as gifted as he is offensively, he may be the best shooting big man of all time, but as gifted as he is, he's not a guy that's going to be able to lead the Minnesota Timberwolves to the promised land. And I think that if the Timberwolves have any hope at winning a championship in the near future, it's going to be on Anthony Edwards' hands, and it's going to be led by him, because Karl Anthony Towns, like I said, as gifted as he is, I just don't think that he's that guy to be leading them. I think he's a great number two to have. And And with Rudy Gobert here, I think this is a really good role for Karl Anthony Towns. I know he's definitely talented, and him being in that number 2 role is definitely going to go a long way. But, Anthony Edwards, he's going to have to establish himself because, he doesn't have that big contract just yet. Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns are getting paid the big bucks. So it's not like they're just going to let him come in and just be the number 1 guy. They're going to let Anthony Edwards have his shine. But can Edwards assert himself and become the number 1 guy on that offense and become the focal point? And when he does, how high is he going to lead them? Because I think that if he comes into his own, that's really when you can see the championship upside formed for the Minnesota Timberwolves. I don't think you can really build a championship team off of 2 really great big men. You can build a good team off of them, and you can catch really bad teams napping with Gobert and Cat just being there. But if Anthony Edwards can take a 3rd-year leap and go from just being a really promising young player to being a legit top 15, even top 10 player, I think that Minnesota can definitely go from being just a fringe playoff team to a title contender. So those are the 2 things that I look at when it comes to the Timberwolves. I think they have a solid roster around them. Even after the Gobert trade, they were able to build a relatively solid, core around their guys. But, definitely going to be leaning on Gobert and Edwards to take a leap and to see what the Timberwolves can do. It's going to be really interesting to see, especially after that trade. They went all in 4 first-round picks for Rudy Gobert. So really, there's no turning back. And Gobert, when it comes to a center like him, you can't imagine that, he's going to be the best player or the player he is right now on the contract. The later years of his contract, it's going to get really bad. But the first 2 years, that's where you got to capitalize, especially when you're not paying Anthony Edwards much. Because once you got to pay Anthony Edwards the max, like 67% of your cap space is going toward 3 players: Edwards, Cat, and Rudy Gobert. But, in terms of what I think the Timberwolves are going to do this year, like I said, they're definitely a playoff team. They're definitely a playoff roster. But Rudy Gobert is going to have to bring his A game in the playoffs. And if the Timberwolves are more of what we saw in Utah, I think that the question marks are definitely going to start to form. Like, how much of an impact does Rudy Gobert have? Is he a guy that just kind of, sits in the paint, doesn't really do anything? Or can he really lead a defense to being in that contender status?